Welcome everyone, Dr. Thor here, and get ready for Gnosis. Well, I'm doing this book review on a person who's always intrigued me, and that's the Harry Houdini, the secret life of Harry Houdini, the making of America's first superhero. Well, I think that's a little bit over glorification. Well, I've always wanted to know what made this guy tick, because it's kind of interesting. His bizarre campaign against psychics and others, and his really rude and insulting attitude towards what Sir Arthur Conan Doyle considered him his friend. And much has been written about him. I wanted to find out what. Now, this book is written by a person who is very much supportive of Harry Houdini and otherwise named as Eric Weiss. And what few people understand is that he was at his peak in the late 1800s, 1899, 1901, 1910s. Now, you're talking about an awful long time ago where there were barely even cars. We're talking about a completely different society, and basically, it has a very interesting background. And one of the things, the author does point out a few of his shortcomings, which I think people should understand his personality. Now, anybody who reaches a high level, particularly through struggle, tends to be a little egotistical. They also tend to get upset at other people that are doing similar jobs. But there's a lot of very nasty stuff with him. And it's important to bring this out to understand where he was coming from. Now, first of all, he started out in vaudeville because you got to remember there wasn't even radio yet. So what did people do? Well, they went out to the theaters. There was barely. There wasn't even talkies yet. So there were some movies, I guess, being made towards the latter end of his life. But the bottom line is people went out to the stage and they had performers up there and they had circuses and this is what people did. They actually went out to places and paid their money to see acts of all types, stage plays, etc. And that's what he started to get involved in and was a complete and total flop. Couldn't make a living. But let's go back to one interesting area in his life. Now, when he came over here, his father was, I don't know if he, it's hard to understand what the person meant in the book. His father was a rabbi, or kind of a self-appointed rabbi. Apparently, he was an older man. He got over here, and he was appointed or took over the position of a rabbi in New York somewhere. This went on for a year or two, I'm not sure how long, and he was unceremoniously thrown out of the position, put on the street with his family, and told to leave. Now, there is no explanation for this, and I'm not sure the author could find out or that it would be told, etc. This seems to me to be very extreme attitude by a group of people who are supposed to be sticking together. Now, I've heard, and of course, this is the same thing that can happen with any kind of churches, that the congregation kind of votes you in. So if they're not happy with you, they can vote you out. And this means the Christian churches as well, which I was unaware of. Apparently, this was the case with the Jewish religion as well. Now, they said that he was just too old-fashioned, too strict, whatever. There was really no clarification of why this actually happened. Now, I find this very strange, and I'm not sure how we could possibly get to the bottom of it, but sounds to me somebody did something very improper. To have an entire family take them and throw them out on the street just because you're unhappy with the rabbi sounds to me to be very extreme. What gives us a further tale of telling about his father is that he was never able, apparently, to ever get another synagogue rabbi job again. Why? Wouldn't there be a shortage of them? The Jewish religion even had welfare offices to help out further Jews. Why did he never get another position? Well, it seems to me something improper went on there. Something very improper, and I don't want to make any conclusions on any of it whatsoever. There doesn't seem to be any mentioning of abuse within his family by his brothers. He had a brother. Did he have a sister? I'm not sure. It's hard to remember all these books when you're trying to make notes. I try and make notes of these things so I can bring up some salient points. But it doesn't matter how many people. There doesn't seem to be any noting of that. And he seems to have loved his father deeply. Even though, ironically, he did not try and contact his father through mediums who died way before his mother. Interesting. So I'm not sure what happened there, but the problem is that tells me, and generally family members are brought up with similar values and similar problems. So, but you can't condemn everybody, even though people in a family, if they come from a bad family, tend to be scums themselves unless someone can rise above it. Certainly that happened in my own family, and I rose above the evilness of my psychotic father. So the whole idea is that my brothers didn't, though. They were evil, psychotic bastards. So the whole idea is that all of these things tend to add up into a huge problem here. So I just have to second guess. I don't want to claim anything on anybody. I don't know, obviously. But I said that's very strange. And it seems to be even stranger with a Jewish community that wants to stick together and is being persecuted. So what went on there? So after that, and as he said, he didn't try and contact his father. Why? Okay, and people didn't talk about things being done within families much back then. I'm certainly doubt that he'd want to bring that out about his family if there was something bad there, whether there's any kind of abuse, and we just don't know. Okay, moving on to that, he was one of the slowest rising performers out there. He found a great difficulty. Nobody was interested in his handcuff tricks. Now, the bottom line is that we need to understand that Houdini was an escape artist. Now, there's a big difference between a magician and an escape artist. In this day and age, they generally do both, and he did both to a certain extent. But he gained his fame as an escape artist, and quite an amazing one. We have to give him credit for that. All the escapes from handcuffs and straitjackets and everything else are mind-blowing. Basically, there wasn't anybody who could design handcuffs for some reason or another that he couldn't escape from. Very, very amazing. But people were not impressed by it. It's just a dumb trick. So this is what he was getting. Very interesting. He also used to do these escapes even naked, so that there was no place he could technically hide a key. Some people claim that maybe he swallowed them. Other ones claim that he put them up his butt. We don't know if he was using keys, but generally you have to have some sort of tool. It was interesting to note in the book, which of course modern magicians do, is that apparently he had a fake finger on his hand and nobody noticed it because you don't really count people's fingers. And the fake finger that they would search him everywhere else, strip him naked, where his tools were. Isn't that interesting? But he was down and out most of his career initially. Couldn't survive, was starving, tried to sell all of his ideas for $25 to a reporter, tried to set up a magic school, tried to write little books. None of it worked. And he was desperate to survive. And of course, the Hollywood, as we could call it today, was always kind of shady. People didn't trust them. They didn't make a lot of money. They moved around town. The women were considered prostitutes. So, this is what vaudeville was all about. And as I said, he died in what was that? Did I just see here? 1925? So you're talking about, that's the error, 1926. October 31st, if that's true, Halloween, he died on 26. So you got to remember, this is barely, I'm not sure when the first talkie was made, but they may have had talkies by then. Of course, they had cameras and photography because we have lots of pictures of him. But he had horrible time. Nobody wanted to see his acts. He couldn't get anybody to do it. To watch him. So he started doing regular magic tricks and other things, working for the circus, doing certain bits. And all of this kind of got him by in different areas. Of course, working for the circus was a steady paycheck, and he was able to get around that way and survive for a while. But none of his theatrical shows worked until he started doing what was popular at that time. And that was spiritualism, and particularly spiritualism and psychic acts. This saved him from losing everything and probably quitting show business, which is ironic. So there were books published then on how to actually do all these spiritual acts, how to create all these things, and they're still out there if you want to find them, where you can, how to make a spiritualist act, and this was something that everybody flocked to. People love personal stuff. People are saddened and depressed by their relatives who have passed, and people want communication. They want to bring them back. This is normal. And this is what I don't have, why I don't have gripes for these things. People feel that they've made contact, and for all we know, they have, and this gives them some ease in life, just like the tent show people. Pop Off and Benny Hinn that do a whole bunch of bizarre healings. Benny Hinn I call a voodoo pastor. He blows on people like he's got magic dust. So all these things put on one hell of a show, and I think they're fun shows. But they did research Benny Hinn, some reporter did, and apparently he's never healed anybody, alleged by this particular reporter. And probably not. So even the placebo effect has never worked for him. I find that hard to believe. But I guess this is part of the reality of it all. So what do we do with all that? So he started a spiritualist act, which included everything that spiritualists do. He also did what was called mentalism acts, which apparently go back a long time, just like Kreskin does. And people loved this. And he made a lot of money from it, was able to then move on. But he did have, there's one statement in the book that I have a little bit of controversy with. He said he taught his wife, who he worked with, she played the medium sometimes, he did, to go into trances so she could do readings for people, psychic readings. What? Now, is this meant to be fake? Or were these trances that he could then read, she could then read minds, and he could read minds, not doing the other things? But there was also a whole bunch of little tricks he did to become off as this great psychic, which I'm assuming is even done to this day to some extent. And that is the fact that, and he did some very sneaky things. But of course, you got to remember this is the early 1900s, 1800s. There's no TV, there's no telephones. People, all they did was gossip. Okay? So you could go into town and who would come to the show again? Everybody would go to the show. That's what you did. So I said that at the beginning here. It's important to know that. And you're talking about little towns. So all you had to do was talk to a few popular people, the saloon owner, a few other people, slip them a few bucks, and they would tell you about the going-ons. So this guy was murdered, this guy was caught doing something, whatever, and he would get this information. He would also go to the graveyards and write down people their names and state when they died. And of course, you would never think someone would do that. So when someone states, Bill Alexander died from a horrible disease, and you would get information there as well. Very interesting. Maybe what he died of, what he said. And of course, you state that as an outsider in a music hall, and nobody would ever think he'd go to the graveyard and write this stuff down and remember it. So you put together these elaborate shows. He even went so far as to become a Bible salesman in this community that sold a new musical Bible. And of course, this was probably hot stuff back then in 1910. A musical Bible? Woo! They don't even have those now that I know of, but I mean, that's kind of cool. So he would go around and he would show these to this people, and then he would, I'm assuming he sold some of them, but he would get the old Bible out and compare it, and then he would open it up and say, look at the difference, and they would have their personal information in there. Interesting. I'm assuming he went in disguise, or maybe somebody else did it, who knows. But he would get this personal information. And again, they're small towns. People know this stuff about each other. But if you state something very personal about someone in an audience, well, you're this genius. So he did this. I'm not sure for how long he did this, but he needed to do this. This got him back on his feet while he was trying to develop his escape artist things, which he was the master of handcuffs, and quite the truth to that. Apparently, he could open every possible handcuff. And what I was surprised here is how nasty people were to him. So I guess things have never changed. People are nasty now, corrupt police, the same old story. And there's very, very interesting stories here, which I'll cover in other audios. This one is just part one of this book. We'll come up with the second part of this as well. But I think it takes noting because this is an important character for people involved in the psychic sciences, because this is one of the people they point to as being this great person who knew everything. So apparently, he also brought people up to stick pins and things in his face and cheeks, etc., and he wouldn't bleed. He's practiced mental arts that he learned in books from the Hindus and so forth. So this was a guy who developed his psychic powers, and as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle thought, that this guy had good psychic powers. And I think he did. But those things were not something that you made that much of money on unless you wanted to kind of extend it. And secondly, you would have to start doing things half psychic, half not. And apparently he wasn't interested in that. And he was not a very good magician. He was an escape artist. So apparently, so this is how he made it. So he moved away from that when he had a little bit of money, went back to the circus to make a few bucks. But he was famous and was often called Harry Handcuff Houdini, because he could get out of every handcuff just about made. And but people were nasty, and he finally figured out a way to get publicity for his show, and that means he would go to the local police departments and tell them to lock me up. Give me your handcuffs, and he would get out of them. Then the police would say, well, this is a miracle, and this would go around, and people started going to his shows. But people did all sorts of things because he could get out of everything. They would rig the cuffs so they couldn't open. What's interesting about that is he was very familiar with getting ripped off and did it to psychics. It's interesting, a person who is persecuted doesn't learn from that and seek truth, and I've known this as one of the great truths of life, is that the persecuted tend to become those who persecute. Very interesting. I saw this on every level. People are not going to fight what happens to them, learn from that, and go on. I mean, we've seen this in entire cultures. The Chinese were horribly treated and butchered and tortured for most of their existence. What did they do when they had the chance? In places like Tibet, they committed horrible atrocities, even though horrible atrocities. They didn't say, well, we shouldn't do this. They decided to be badder and worse than their enemies. And I find this with everything. And it's known that if you're an abused kid, you tend to abuse your kid. It's a learned lifestyle. Really sad, but part of the messed up psychotic human condition. So as we move into that, we need to understand all these things at a higher level. So he did this and came back, and they figured out a way to do this. And then he started to grow in popularity because of this, and was able to get out of any handcuff that wasn't rigged. And some people tightened handcuffs down so the actual pins in them went down to his bone, and he had to rip off part of his skin to get out of these things. So this is the kind of things which is totally unfair. Cuffs shouldn't be that difficult, but these were common practices, and people did a lot of nasty things to put him in horrible pain and try and make him not escape. Now, that's not fair play. That's not doing things correctly, because you wouldn't do that to handcuff a normal person unless you were trying to torture them. So this was a common occurrence that they would do this to him, trying to trip him up. Well, you're not going to get out of my handcuffs, you SOB. What beautiful people. So here we go again. That's like 100 years ago, and people are just as sucky and bad. So this was quite interesting, and finally over time he was able to get out of these, and particularly in England he was finally, which is typical of a lot of things, even Uri Geller, who's very popular still in England and not given any credit here. So in America he wasn't taken overly seriously until he was a big hit in England. So they did everything possible to hurt and mess him up for these things, which are amazing in general. If you can get out of handcuffs just generally, that's pretty amazing. So all the other things they did, there's people who made special handcuffs to try and trip him up, but anything that could open, and some people rigged things that couldn't be opened. As I said, he did the same thing to psychics when he actually rigged some of the boxes that they were supposed to see into and everything else, and actually locked them so they would make the person fail. And he was good at this, and he knew what to do. And Arthur Conan Doyle caught him doing this on several occasions. So it shows the kind of tricky person he was. He wanted to be right at all costs. But it even goes further with him. So, being the giant egotist that he is, and of course they seem to have left out things that, as I said, this issue of his father, the rabbi, I haven't got to the part in the book here yet that they state, from what I understood, he was a Mason. I'm still finishing the book, the last half of it. He also, apparently, particularly in England, where he had lots of friends and made lots of money, became a spy for them to tour through Germany in particular, who was a major threat to the world at that time, and tried to get information on them and Russians and other people. And then he reported back to the authorities in England. I forget who it actually was, but there seemed to have been also an interesting connection between the American Secret Service and secret services in general. They found that if their agents learned sleight of hands and magical tricks, that this allowed them to do their job better. Isn't that interesting? Isn't it interesting that these kind of things that are done by magicians are done by, quote, secret type agents to trick people, and why not? It makes sense. How to create an illusion, how to do something in front of someone that they don't get, how to pick their pocket. They could have all sorts of things in there, keys, secret messages. Makes sense, and so the American Secret Service, which was formed around the time he was active, worked with that, and so did the police in England, Scotland Yard, etc. So isn't that interesting? Something I didn't think of or know about. Particularly people like BBC reporters, people who've interviewed me were alleged to be spies, and of course they worked for different people. What a cover! It's amazing how somebody can do a joke story one day and then talk to gangs the next day in places like Nigeria. Well, that's a great way to, well, this guy's a funny guy. He did this. And of course, this is very typical. So these people are usually working for, and these are great covers. So you get around, you talk to people, everybody loves you, you're a celebrity, they tell you things they normally wouldn't. You get to meet officials, mayors, politicians, police, etc. So it was very interesting, and of course you got a lot of hassles and problems as well. They tried to, of course, in Germany, they tried to accuse him of fraud and arrest him, and the different typical corruptions and problems that you get through the Gestapo that was very active from the beginning. It doesn't matter what they're called, it's the same attitude. People seem to forget that. So, but I was very surprised there with that. And he did study, as I've mentioned, psychic powers and developing them, and probably had a very good intuition and psychic abilities. And he was probably able to read minds somewhat. But he got out of the spiritualism because he didn't like it. And when he told people things, they thought he was a god. He didn't like the fact that he was tricking them and people were going along with it. Now, I find this hard to believe because that's not really his personality. He was a conniving guy that wanted to be held up on a very high level and enjoyed the ego of it and wanted to be the Mr. Special. So I don't particularly buy that. I think he just didn't like the fact that he couldn't make it as handcuffed Houdini. Handcuff Houdini was what he wanted to be. He wanted to do escape artist stuff. He wanted something much more dramatic than doing mentalism and spiritualism, which was everywhere. So, this is part, and they didn't mention that he set up false spiritualist people that he could bust. He was involved in it. He knew the whole process. All these things went on, and while he did unmask a few people, as they stated, I give people a lot of help doing this, and I see nothing wrong with it. How serious you take it is your own personal reality, and it's up to you. I'm assuming if you feel contact has been made, that this is very comforting. If you dismiss it, well, what harm is done? So, most magicians don't come up and tell you it's a trick. So all sorts of things happened. He got into the usual trouble from authorities. I mean, people really looked at this stuff as con artist type things and were upset that he was able to do this and felt that it was some sort of fraud. And you couldn't do fraudulent acts like you can do today. You know, all the magicians from Copperfield to Chris Angel are all doing fraudulent acts. Nothing they do is real. And that's very interesting. So this was against the law to some degree. So I don't know how other magicians got away with it unless they stated it. But if you didn't state that, you were in violation of the law. Very, very interesting. So, you know, he copied the spiritualists. He had a great spiritual show. He had a lot of people that once he was popular copied him, even used his name in one form or another. They also tried to defame him and say they were better than him. Well, wasn't this interesting? Again, this is in the 1920s, and this never seems to change. Nothing in life seems to change. You have a lot of copy people. You have a lot of people saying they're better than him. Some people even misrepresented themselves and used similar names so that you'd think it was him. Everything to steal his thunder, and he even had people that made handcuffs for him at one time, special types that he could get out of, that went on their own and did it. You know, and of course, this is very typical of any types of businesses. So I find that very interesting. So he finally gained a lot of popularity, and he was paid a lot of money by a lot of people. So he became very wealthy and bought very large estates and had everything that he desired after these basically starving at times. And of course, his family being put under horrible pressure. But, you know, he did make it in a period of time, but I don't know if you consider, 10, 20 years of that. But he made a lot of money and did quite well once he got this fame from being this fantastic escape artist. And for what they detail in the book of what he did and how people brought him things and tried to trick him. And as he said, some made sure the handcuffs couldn't come off. So it was completely unfair. Other ones made sure they made it extremely painful. And to get out of those, he virtually had to destroy his hands to a large degree. So these were all things that went on. How much of this was true and not, and part of publicity, we don't know. But I'm sure it was a lot of people that did that. Now, he named himself after Robert Houdin. And he called him who he worked under, and who he was a person that named himself Houdini after Houdin, who was a person he worked with. Now the problem is, and taught him, it was his mentor. But what's important about this is he started out writing a book on magic and was going to give people the due, saying that, none of these magicians were ever recorded. And of course, you got to remember that the tricks are passed on for hundreds of years, and people do the same tricks over and over again. And then what they do is put their own actual spin on it, or they do it grander, or they use different looking things. But basically, it's the same trick. So this is very common, and apparently, while he was researching this, he wanted to find out more about this guy, and he was found out that he did a lot of tricks similar to other people. And we're not really know who has the pedigree to everything. I think that's childish as a magician to think that what they do is learned always by them. After all, Houdini was taught by Robert Houdin. So what does that mean? He learned all these things, and the fact is that what does that mean? All of this is why he would then change his book from A Little History of Magic to basically the attack on Robert Houdin as being a big fraud, that everything he ever did, and he was a Frenchman, that was stolen from other people, that he never did anything himself. Well, it's quite interesting that he would go and discredit his mentor so that he would look like he was much better and special. A lot of information he got was from a guy who never met this man and didn't know anything about him. So the whole idea is that he got this information from a person that didn't ever meet Robert Houdin, and he was a German who, here again, that always comes up, doesn't it? And he just told him a bunch of outright lies, and Houdini went ahead and put all these lies in, added to the lies himself to make his book more serious. I mean, pretty much there were outright lies in that book. So Houdini made himself out to be a terrible researcher and fool, a guy who was easily tricked, that got into ego and wrote a big fake thing. Now that's important to understand because of the fact this is a researcher. Well, really? I'm wondering here if Unamazing Randy, who did the same kind of lying and cheating throughout his entire history, is not the reincarnation of Harry Houdini. Of course, he never was a good escape artist, but whatever. So the whole idea is that this is the kind of personality that we need to know, that he was a very nasty guy. He wanted to be known as the best. He wanted, and if that meant discrediting everyone around him, even people that helped him, he would do that. And of course, he did that with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle as well, who befriended him, and they tried to have communication and so forth. And he would go out and defame and talk the most personal things that Conan Doyle would talk to him about, and everything else he would then go out and talk to the press about, just to defame spiritualists, which he used to do himself and probably had some good psychic abilities. But it's hard to sell that. It's like Uri Geller bending spoons for 2 hours. How long is that going to go on? You're going to have to do other stuff. So the point is that kind of act was wearing thin, and so he decided to get out of that into where he wanted to be known as, and what he tried to make money from the beginning. Now, you got to remember, he started off as this Harry Handcuff Houdini, and this is what he wanted to be known for. So he didn't certainly want to be known for spiritualism or psychic powers, and of course, they were taking a huge amount of the business. This was a huge business. And you got to remember, these people would put on these shows in places like he was going to. They would have it in private houses. And they were taking an awful lot of customers away. And this, again, was taking money away from him and fellow magicians. So remember that. That's a great motivation. His entire career was in jeopardy by the spiritualist movement. And there was a much more draw than seeing somebody get out of handcuffs or doing some sleight of hand with cards than talking to a dead relative. So there's a great appeal there. And when he did that, his houses, the houses were packed with people looking for messages and seeing what other people got. So we got to understand that. So that's part of the interesting part of the whole story, is how he went after his mentor, the person he actually named himself out of, and discredited him so he would be greater than his mentor. So this is pretty sad on information that was not verified by a person who never met the other one, who told him gossip. And even the author of this book states that he printed outright lies. Now, I don't know what all those were, and the details aren't really important because who can verify any details anyway? But the bottom line is that it went out and showed you the kind of attitude he had. He also printed, he did a lot of publishing himself. It turned out to be monthly magazines on magic and other things, and took ads for that and made money on it. And kind of was, as the author describes, kind of a silly and goofy magazine that he published. He also got into a big argument with the head of the Magical Association at that time and tried to push him out, tried to get him thrown out because he took insult to something that he said, and thinking that was to him. And of course, it may have been insulting, and the fact is that most handcuffed people, he said, are now doing dime shows for the circuses, and he took that as an attack on him. So I don't know, maybe it was. But he became very nasty after that, went the head of the Magic Association, and at that time, and caused a lot of trouble. Was that appropriate? I don't know. But you can see that he's got a temper. He's very self-centered. He's very egotistical. And this is, we have to do that. Was he a great escape artist? Was he a great handcuff guy? Yes, he was. He pretty much could get out of any legitimate lock. Plain and simple. There also was a lot of drama in his shows, like they do today. I can't get out, I'm dying. Well, we've seen this many times in different shows, even with Penn and Teller, where they put Teller in a giant glass container and he fakes drowning. So the whole idea is that this is all part of the effects to cause drama. So a lot of that was going on. So we don't know if he ever was in any deep trouble in anything he did. But needless to say, he also had relatively bad health and was sick often. And this will be gone into further as we get in part 2 of this, as we go into his actual health and other areas of his life.